Welcome to Widemindedness with Victoria Ball, the podcast in which I interview expert guests who want to join me in celebrating that life is not black and white. Our society is increasingly divided, and the us versus them mentality seems to dominate our conversations and relationships with others. I believe that life is much richer when we widen our minds to consider multiple opinions and perspectives. So challenge your assumptions and let's become truly wide-minded together. I am so excited to be joined today by Eamonn Gearon, a journalist, author, analyst and historian who specialises in all things related to the Middle East and North Africa. He has lived with the Bedu in Egypt's western desert and conducted a number of lengthy, solo, camel-powered explorations of the Sahara. After living in and writing about the region for more than 20 years, Eamonn moved to Washington, D.C., where he was asked to design and run area studies training for the US Department of State. He now runs Middle East North Africa training efforts for the British government at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Among his writing credits are a history of the Sahara and 2 lecture series on the history of the Middle East for the Great Courses, available via Audible, which I cannot recommend highly enough. 2021 will see the release of his new History of the Middle East in the 20th Century, also for the Great Courses. Eamonn is a professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, and has also taught at the American University in Cairo and the University of London. Eamonn, hello! I have been fascinated by the Islamic Golden Age since I was 16 years old. I read Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge because of it, and my appreciation of this idea of cultural flourishing of this period was really what sparked the very birth and idea of wide-mindedness.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today, Victoria. And the period of the Islamic Golden Age is one that is endlessly fascinating. And alas, I mean, I've been immersed in it for a number of years while I was producing a lecture series. But even so, it's astonishing to me how little known this period is. And when people do speak about it, often they're critics. And it's a terrible tragedy in our days that anything to do with the Middle East or anything that has the word Islam attached to it is immediately politicized, and it's foolish to say the least that should be the case. Okay, the term Islamic Golden Age might be an imperfect label, but it's the one that we've got, and it's quite useful as a starting point to start exploring what was taking place across a huge swathe of the world for 500 years or so.
When I give talks and lectures on wide-mindedness, I'm often asked, is there a period of history that I would consider to be particularly wide-minded? And I tend to cite this period. This Islamic Golden Age. And, you know, it's a period that, thanks to Petrarch, we often refer to as the Dark Ages. But as I know you're going to tell us today, it was just anything but. In your brilliant lecture series on this, you quote Bernard Lewis. The Islamic culture of the Middle East was the first culture that was truly international, intercultural, interracial, and, in a sense, intercontinental. And its contribution, both direct and indirect, to the modern world is immense. Just to set the scene for my listeners, can you start by telling us a bit more about the period in question?
I'm going to chuck a couple of dates out there just because I think It's important in terms of framing where we are. So the first date I think that people who aren't familiar perhaps with Middle Eastern history or Islamic history should have in mind is the year 632. And that's the traditional date for the death of Islam's greatest or holiest prophet in their tradition, and that's Muhammad, of course. Mm-hmm. So there, 632, death of Muhammad, who comes next? It's a question of succession. Who's going to take over? There are differences of opinions about whether or not he appointed somebody or other. It doesn't matter for our purposes. We go forward some 30-odd years to the birth of the first of the great Islamic caliphates. Now, I know caliphate is a word that's been in the news a lot, particularly since the Arab uprisings with the rise of the so-called Islamic State or Daesh. And they were claiming that they were a new caliphate, which they weren't in any way, shape or form. But the first great caliphate in Middle Eastern history are the Umayyads. And the Umayyads have their capital in the city of Damascus. And part of their success relied for the 90 years that they were in power, from 661 to 750, on co-opting a lot of what Byzantine Christianity had in terms of organization and bureaucracy. But the Umayyads, as I just mentioned, had 90 years in power, based in Damascus, and they were overthrown in the year 750. Now that's our number, that's our date for jumping into the Islamic Golden Age. It's not to say that the Umayyads didn't achieve anything, because they achieved a great deal, but it's the period after the Umayyads and the birth of the next caliphate, who were the Abbasids, named after an Abbas, a person related to Muhammad's family. But it's the Abbasids who, after they come to power, look around for where they're going to build their new capital. And this was very important for them. They said, we're a new caliphate. We need to establish our own identity. We're not going to move into a pre-existing city, such as the Umayyads had with Byzantine Damascus. We want a new capital. And they looked around and they chose a site which we know today as Baghdad. And so it's the founding of Baghdad in 762 that, for me, and it's arguably an arbitrary date, but marks the start of the Islamic Golden Age, with the building of a new imperial complex in modern-day Iraq.
And was there anything in the town or the city we now know as Baghdad before?
It was a tiny village. It was nothing particularly. It's on the banks of the river, as you know, the great rivers that run through modern Iraq and indeed ancient Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and the Tigris, meant that there was always communication. I mean, this sits in what we used to call the Fertile Crescent. I don't know that the term is used as much today as it once was, but the fact of there being a Fertile Crescent, something which from the earliest periods of human recorded history allowed for agriculture, and with agriculture allowed for settlements, and with settlements and agriculture and growing wealth allowed for the emergence of writing as we know it. I mean, the ancient empires, way before the period we're discussing, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, they're all from this part of the world. So you might think, well, the Abbasids had a foot up already by finding themselves placed in this area or arena where great civilizations had been before. But they chose it in part, this site of what we now call Baghdad, because of its connections along the river, because they could reach out and communicate with other civilizations. It was always on their minds that trade was going to be important. And with trade, there has to be, perhaps with an imperial power, a degree of control over those trade routes, for sure. But also there has to be a degree of trust, whether that's just in the money that's being employed or the fact that bills will be paid. You know, if you don't have that trust in trade, trust in commerce, then you're on a hiding to nowhere. There's only so much conquest, I should say, can only take you so far. After the conquests, if you want an empire that's going to last you a while, you have to settle down, have a rule of law, and have free trade at whatever level that is. I'm not making any arguments for the 21st century. I'm just saying that, by and large, throughout human history, successful empires have had to have trading partners beyond their borders.
Yes, and that was something that marked that shift that you're discussing between the sort of first Islamic rulers and then moving into this Abbasid period, that it changed maybe from that first conquest phase into a more of a consolidation phase. Is that right?
That's very, very true. It's very interesting that the earliest days of Islamic conquest, we're talking about during the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the days after, when Persia was first conquered and North Africa was first conquered. It's interesting that the Muslim soldiers, by and large, were not allowed to take the best agricultural land. They were told that they had to build new settlements beyond the existing towns and cities, in part so as not to upset the locals. And I don't mean they were all touchy-feely and nice. They weren't. They were conquerors, to be sure. But the fact is they were soldiers and they were on a conquest. They didn't want to become farmers. That came later. That came after they'd established their authority and control. But during the period of expansion, you don't want to make your warriors into farmers. It doesn't make sense. And there is also that idea that as the empire grows and grows and grows, yet you do need more land to give to retiring soldiers or booty, forms of reward. But it comes later, it's after the conquest. If we can accept 762 and the founding of Baghdad as more or less the start of the Islamic Golden Age, why don't we look ahead to the year 1258 and the Mongol destruction of Baghdad as our end point? These are, of course, somewhat artificial bookends. It's not like the First World War, where you have a shot fired in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, and then you have the armistice signed in November 1918. It's not like that. This period in history we're looking at doesn't have sharp edges.
Yes.
But 1258, I think, suits us very well, because never again would there be an Islamic empire that covered anything like the amount of territory it did, or have the power that it did. And when you have certain terrorist groups and others who were just culturally feeling the loss of the greatness that once was Islamic civilizations, people often look back to 1258 and say, well, that was the moment when we've never recovered our cultural, intellectual greatness. So that'll be the jumping off point. Now, many of my friends and colleagues who know this period too will say, well, for them, the Islamic Golden Age really finishes in as early as the 9th century or 10th century. And I say, fair enough, but cultural advance didn't stop in the 9th and 10th century, or indeed in 1258. It's just that, as I said, when the Abbasids are finally routed by the Mongol invaders, the knowledge bases, the intellectual centers are on a smaller scale, and they're more diffused. So you find them in Central Asia, you find them in modern-day Afghanistan. You certainly find those centers transferring their knowledge into Western Europe, which is very important for the later Renaissance in Europe. But the period of growth and the great cultural flourishing that we're going to discuss, certainly done by 1258. And I just say one other thing that's really important, is that it's funny, the day that the lecture series was first put online and first published, I immediately attracted critics saying, oh, more Islamist apologia. This chap is an apologist for Islam. And I did say, well, you can't possibly have even heard 30 minutes of the first lecture before you're throwing these brickbats. And the fact is, I'm not an apologist for anyone. And it's critically important to understand that the cultural flourishing that takes place during the Islamic Golden Age was not a one-way street of perfection. There were many bad rulers. There were many desperate times for all people of all faiths and none. But the successful periods are those when they work together and are accepting. That's, I think, the biggest takeaway for the whole era.
That word, the Islamic Golden Age, it's a bit like the bookends. We have to call it something, and it makes sense because the caliphs were Islamic themselves.
Sure.
But of course, it's not to say everything within that was done under the banner of religion, or it was a religious movement.
Absolutely. And the term Islamic is flawed. It's too loaded, perhaps. It's, if we think about Christendom, does everything that happens, is it directly related to a church or a great cathedral? I mean, when we discuss the Islamic Golden Age and we look at an object of, let's say, some beautiful carved ivory hunting scenes where you have men on horses chasing down lions and other things, is that Islamic? Perhaps not. If you look at a great cathedral or a mosque building, I think we could definitely attach the religious label to that because it has a specific purpose. But I think it's just more important to understand that stuff which is made, as you say, under the rule or under the patronage of Muslim rulers, we can, I think, justifiably say it's the Islamic Golden Age for that reason. They're Islamic polities that reigned.
Yes. And I think really the key reason I asked you just to define this period to start with is to just impress upon our listeners that this is not a flash in the pan. However we take those start and end dates, we're not talking about 20 years here. We're talking about a serious chunk of history.
It's important to understand that the success and longevity of this period, to a large extent, relied on those enlightened rulers, A, giving a lot of money to sponsor the learning, but B, and more importantly perhaps even than the patronage, was an acknowledgement of the debt they owed to those that came before. There are very few wise men or women that say, well, I did this all myself. When Isaac Newton talks about standing on the shoulders of giants, he was looking back to scholars, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars from the Islamic Golden Age as part of that legacy that he inherited.
I would love you to guide us through the period's diversity and introduce us to the range of thinking, the approaches to government that existed. And then I'd like, if I could, to ask you to explain how this led to prosperity and openness to ideas and some of the greatest cultural flourishing that we have seen throughout human history.
These were not democratic states. I mean, let's not beat about the bush. There was a caliph. These were people that ruled by the sword, but that's been the case of empires throughout human history.
Yes.
You don't get to the top by playing nicey-nicey. I mean, it's a bit like Game of Thrones, but in the real world. I mean, there are always allegiances being made and weddings being effected, unions between great families. But we see that once they have power, there's a question, well, what do we do with it? Once your empire has expanded perhaps to its natural extent, what are we going to do with the wealth and the different peoples that we've inherited? It's very telling that for the Abbasids and their new capital, Baghdad, that a lot of their advisors came from Persia. Now,
the viziers.
Indeed, viziers. The fact is that Arabic was a relatively new written language at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The fact is that the cities and settlements of the Arabian Peninsula during this period, before the 8th century, were not grand centres. They didn't have the cultural importance of, say, ancient Rome or any number of Persian cities. So when the Arab armies invade and take over Persia, they're confronted with a very ancient civilization in Persia. And what they realize is, we don't have all the answers, and maybe these Persians don't either. What we've got is we're an empire on the up at the moment. We've got the Arabic language and we've got the Quran. They're saying, look, we are the top dogs at the moment, but you guys have got something that we could use. And so I'm going to talk shortly about one of the most famous caliphs from the early Abbasid period. That's Harun al-Rashid. He spent a lot of his childhood growing up in Persia, and he had Persian families to help him. And that's really important. And from the earliest days, I think they recognized their limitations in terms of what they could do. Perhaps most importantly, and you'd see this in ancient Egypt as much as anywhere else, bureaucracy. If you haven't got a good system of bureaucracy in place, how do you keep track of who owes what, of taxation, of land rights, of legal responsibilities? And so a lot of the Persian bureaucracy came into the Abbasid Caliphate, and I think was critical in allowing them to be successful for as long as they were.
You suggested that you might guide us through the period with the help of 3 key figures. You've mentioned one just now. 3 names, 3 stories. Do you just want to give us an idea of the framework that you might take to show us our way through?
Absolutely. I've picked 3 that really came into my head at random. There are so many fabulous characters that you could do a Islamic Golden Age podcast series that would last you 52 weeks and another year.
And of course, actually, from my perspective, so many of them, you could absolutely ascribe this adjective of wide-minded to them. This was the era of polymaths and very big open thinkers.
It is. Before I talk about the 3 names, you brought up the term polymath. When I was writing the lecture series, there are 24 lectures in the series. I found it got a bit boring because every new character I was introducing, I had to honestly describe them as a polymath. And I thought, if you want to write well, you should really try and avoid repeating words. But it was true. I mean, these people were scientists as well as poets. And in fact, much of the scientific work they did, much of the work in physics, much of the work in biology and chemistry, they wrote in verse form.
Incredible.
That was it's a bit like being an educated person 100 years ago in the UK. You would have just Latin would be standard, as would the ability to draw, as would the ability to ride a horse, etc., and so on and so forth. they were all very well-rounded individuals. Not always very nice, but certainly well-rounded.
That is something that a lot of my guests in this series, I think, have an element of this idea of polymathy or in their experience and their background. And it's just so interesting to situate this in that discussion of this notion of broad-mindedness, open to different ideas, seeing no barrier or division between different skills is so essential to this period. And that's really the crux of why I was so keen to get you to come and speak to us about it.
I wonder if we might get away from that hyper-specialisation in the modern world, particularly with events being what they are and people having to be more flexible these days and learning new skills. I mean, learning new skills, new languages is always a good thing. I was having a chat with my boy the other day. He's 5. 5-year-old son, and it came up the what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said, on Mondays I'll be an artist, on Tuesdays I'll be a policeman, on Wednesdays I'll be an astronaut. And he wasn't joking. It's just this: why would I choose one thing? When that's
so
sort of a child's mind understands that they're capable of limitless. But of course, if you have to spend X number of years in medical school, and then you have debt, and then you have family, you don't get to choose to become an architect as well, perhaps. But
the figures of this period saw no conflict between sitting, looking at the stars, working out astronomy from them, and then writing poetry about that.
I have a post at Johns Hopkins SAIS. They received a massive endowment at the University of Johns Hopkins from former New York Mayor Bloomberg. I mean, it was tens of millions.
When I invited Eamonn Gearon to speak to me, I did have a sneaking suspicion that we may not be able to fit the centuries of history that we now call the Islamic Golden Age into 20 minutes of a podcast. But luckily for me, and I hope for you, Eamonn has agreed to speak to me for a little longer. So do come back for part 2 of this fascinating interview.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Widemindedness with Victoria Ball. Help others learn about it by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. For more great wide-minded content, follow @Widemindedness Victoria Ball on Instagram, @Widemindedness on Twitter, and sign up to the monthly newsletter at victoria-ball.com.